You are now listening to EdYOUcate, the most fired up educational podcast there is. EdYOUcate is all about the quality education access to students and how we can provide research-based solutions to free the young minds of the world. On this podcast, we will be exploring different educational experiences, education's greatest of debates, and more. The hottest educational podcast out. EdYOUcate is brought to you from the Albany State University's very own Center for Educational Opportunity. Enjoy.
In today's episode, we will be discussing the schooling experiences of Black boys, culturally relevant pedagogy, critical race theory, and Black boyhood play. We have a special guest today named Bryan, and if you could just give the listeners a little bit of background information about who you are and what you do.
Thank you so very much, Tamila. It is really great and indeed a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. My name is Dr. Bryan. I'm an assistant professor of early childhood education at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. My primary research focuses on the constructed identities and pedagogical styles of Black male teachers in early childhood education and the schooling and childhood play experiences of Black boys in education. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you for that. So I want to start off asking, what are your thoughts about the state of Black males in K-12 schools?
That's a really great question. I like to draw on the story of the Maasai warriors who are from the East African tribe. And when a Maasai meets another Maasai, they ask the question, and how are the children? And when the Maasai responds, the children are well, it means that the community is also well. If we would ask that same questions about the state and the conditions of Black boys in K-12 schools, can we honestly say that Black boys are well in K-12 education? I believe that there are two narratives. We can say that some Black boys are well, but not all Black boys are well. What traditionally happens in the research literature is that we highlight the fact that Black boys are underachieving in school, or that Black boys are a monolithic block of learners who are unwilling to learn or are incapable of performing well in schools, right? However, oftentimes we ignore the systemic inequities that perpetuate such underperformance, right? And so we ignore the ways in which teachers are oftentimes unable to support the academic and social needs of Black boys. We ignore the fact that teachers oftentimes enter classroom spaces with stereotypes and biases, which hinders the way they interact with Black boys in schools, right? And I like to also think about Chimamanda Adichie, who says that there's a danger in a single story. And oftentimes that's the single story when we blame Black boys for the conditions under which they are schooled without considering the systemic inequities that play a role in the underperformance of Black boys in K-12 schools, right? And so the other part of that story is that despite the conditions under which Black boys are schooled, there are some Black boys who are doing well in school. There are Black boys who are performing academically well in important subjects. It's like math and literacy and science, etc. There are Black boys who are enrolled in gifted education and AP courses. There are Black boys who are graduating at the top of their classes. For example, Caleb Anderson, a 12-year-old Black boy, just recently graduated with his associate's degree. And so when we tell the story about Black boys and Black males in K-12 education, we have to be sure that we are engaging in a nuanced conversation that allows us to not only speak to the systemic inequities that negatively impact the schooling of experiences of Black boys, but we must also highlight the brilliance, the potential, and the possibilities of Black boys in K-12 schools.
Thank you for that. So what do you think that schools can do to not only recruit Black male teachers, but retain Black male teachers in order to meet the needs of Black boys in K-12 schools?
Well, I think, and in my work, I argue that when we think about the recruitment of Black male teachers to K-12 classrooms, we also have to think about the schooling conditions of Black boys, right? So if Black boys are mistreated in K through 12 schools, why would they want to pursue teaching as a professional option? So in order to ensure that we're recruiting Black male teachers to classrooms, we have to change the conditions under which Black boys are schooled in order to ensure that the teaching profession is an attractive field and that they are willing to come to these spaces to be teachers.
All right, thank you. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit more about the power of culturally relevant teaching?
Another really good question. Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy in mid-1990s. And the argument in terms of culturally relevant teaching is that it is a concept or a set of practices that are grounded and influenced by Black cultural ways of knowing and being. And by that, I mean that teachers who are culturally relevant knows how to infuse Black culture into their teaching and schooling practices. Right? So they draw on the cultural capital that Black children bring to schooling spaces in order to push back against a curriculum that already highlights the experiences of white children ad nauseum. Right? And so culturally relevant teachers know how to use Black culture to build on students' academic success, cultural competence, and social political awareness. Let me talk about each of those. And so when we think about, or when Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings describes the notion of academic success, she's not simply suggesting that Black children should simply know how to excel on state and national level tests, right? And she argues that academic success is all about helping Black children excel and to be able to move from one grade level to the next. In other words, arming them with the essential academic skills to successfully navigate the schooling process. And then there's this idea of cultural competence, right? And so Black students should learn one culture and their own culture, right? So they should be able to walk away with an educational baggage that not only allows them to understand white culture, but also allows them to understand their own cultures. We know that Black people have contributed to American society in numerous ways. However, those contributions are oftentimes left out of the K-12 curriculum. And so culturally relevant teachers ensure that those contributions are at the heart of the pedagogical and curricular experiences that Black children experience in classrooms. And last but not least is the notion of social political awareness, right? And so Dr. Ladson-Billings argued that Black children should be aware of how they are socially positioned in the world. They should understand or have the ability to not only read the word, right, or to read, write, and to do arithmetic, but they should also have the ability to read the world, understanding that society is oftentimes racist, sexist, classist, and they should be armed with the tools to push back against those isms that negatively impact all of our lives.
So there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory, and it's kind of been like a buzz phrase recently. So can you just give the listeners a better understanding of what critical race theory is and why is it currently under attack?
Jamila, that's another great question. So critical race theory is birthed out of the critical legal studies movement. And so what critical race theorists argues is that concepts of race and racism are foundational to American institutions, right? And so what they are suggesting is that race and racism are endemic to American society, right? So we would find racism in schools. We would find racism in the ways in which people reside in communities, etc. So racism is foundational to American institutions. And there's very little we can do about that, given that our society is built on racism, right? And there are several tenets to CRT, but the idea that race and racism are endemic to American institution is one of the foundational principles or tenets of CRT. So scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and Alan Freeman were instrumental in helping us in understanding the institutional ways in which race and racism impact, and particularly negatively impact, the lives of people of color. And so now CRT has become a buzzword in the news media and popular press. And many contrarians are arguing that CRT is being taught in public K through 12 schools, which is not true. CRT is not being taught in K through 12 schools. CRT is often taught in graduate schools. Graduate students are oftentimes provided this framework to better explicate the ways in which race and racism operates in American society. While there are teachers who may be graduate students and who may take up CRT to inform the ways in which they teach and interact with children in schools, but when we think about CRT and K-12 schooling writ large, we cannot say that CRT is being taught in schools. So what is currently happening now to shut down any conversation or discussion about race, many Republicans and conservatives are negatively describing CRT as a way to ban all discussions of race and racism in schools. And we must be honest, all children need to know how race and racism operate in our society. And I believe that that's our way of growing new human beings who come to understand and who have that social political consciousness to work against the pervasive nature of race and racism. And when we think about our current conversations about CRT, it's really centered on white children, right? So that is to say, because white children feel uncomfortable talking about race and racism, there's a need to ban all discussions of race and racism in schools. But what about Black children who are everyday victims of race and racism in K-12 schools? Schools are a bastion of white supremacy and racism. And there are many ways that Black children are discriminated against and experience racism in schools on a daily basis. And perhaps you can think about your own schooling experience and the ways in which you experience race and racism in schools. So rather than focus on white children's uncomfortableness, or white children's reluctance to engage in conversations about race and racism, we really need to center and prioritize the feelings and the emotions and the experiences of Black children, again, who are everyday victims of white supremacy and racism in schools. So I encourage people to really educate themselves, read the literature on critical race theory rather than listening to a few uninformed, miseducated Republicans who have absolutely no clue or understanding about what CRT is about. And another way that they're pushing this myth about CRT is that they're saying that white people are oftentimes framed as the oppressors. And so the goal of CRT is to reverse roles, right? So Black people will now be situated as those who oppress white folks, and that has absolutely nothing to do with CRT. The very foundation of CRT, I believe, is this notion of critical love, right? Because when you have critical love, you will be able to empathize with the needs of those who are most marginalized in our society. And so although CRT isn't taught in our K-12 schools, it needs to be taught in our K through 12 schools to ensure that we are providing all children a balanced perspective of our history and the experiences of marginalized people in our society.
Wow. As you were talking, something that came to my mind about just summing up everything that you were talking about with us, the schooling experience of Black boys and culturally relevant pedagogy and critical race theory. The two main things that came to my head was that, for this podcast, we're going to have parents listening, teachers, school board leaders, everybody that's, contributes to the whole makeup of education. And so I was thinking about what parents can do to help promote a better self-esteem and a school experience for Black boys, because, we all know that learning, the first time you learn is not when you walk into a school building. It starts at home. So what are things that parents can do to continue to promote a healthy education experience for Black boys at home? That way they have the confidence when they do step into the buildings, for my parent listeners. And also one nugget you can give to teachers that can help them promote better culturally relevant pedagogy or just make sure that the experience for Black boys is better for them. So in some way, could you wrap that up into one?
Yes, no, that's an excellent question. And I think it's very important to include parents in these conversations, because oftentimes parents of color are oftentimes left out of the schooling and educational experiences of their own children. And that is also symptomatic of white supremacy and racism, because oftentimes we prioritize the voices of white parents, right? And so I think it is important that we talk about the ways in which Black parents can supplement or supplant the educational experiences that Black boys having in schools at home. So one thing I recommend is that Black parents teach Black boys their own history. Right. And so Black boys need to have access to books and other texts where they see themselves positively reflected. Right. So Black parents, or parents in general, can provide Black boys mirrors in which they see themselves and windows through which they can see the world. Right. So really supplementing in our curriculum, or home curriculum, I should say, with experiences where Black boys are learning about Black history. Because when Black children learn about their own history, they perform better in schools. They have better racial identities. They're willing to engage in the educational process because they have an educational baggage that would even allow them to challenge their teachers when their teachers aren't telling the full story of what is happening in our nation's history, or what has happened in our nation's history. So really centering Black history in our homes is one way that Black parents can ensure that they are arming Black boys with the essential educational tools prior to even entering into K through 12 classrooms. And teachers, I believe teachers are also important, right? They too should educate themselves about Black history and learn more about Black children. They should also listen, hear, and understand Black children, so that knowledge can inform the way that they teach and engage with Black boys in classroom. And oftentimes teachers are unable to positively interact and engage with Black boys in schools is because they oftentimes are lacking knowledge about the experiences that Black boys bring to classroom spaces. So when they begin to center the voices and perspectives of Black boys and their teaching, they will find the joy in teaching Black boys, right? And I think what happens oftentimes is that teachers are inundated with these deficit ideas and ideologies about Black boys, which hinders the way that they teach and interact with them. So if teachers are courageous, or willing to be courageous and listen and hear and understand the experiences of Black boys, I think they can better empathize with them as a way to better support them academically and socially in K through 12 classrooms.
Wow, thank you so much for everything that you have said. This truly helped me, and I'm pretty sure it helped the listeners understand more about just the schooling experience of Black boys and, of course, culturally relevant pedagogy and CRT. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Nathaniel Bryan, for coming on here. You have just completed the most recent episode of the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for listening to the most fired up educational podcast out. Tune in every first Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. during the 2021 through 2022 academic year.